Hello everyone, warm greetings to all. I hope everyone is doing good and well. I, Dr. Shikha Dhiman, Assistant Professor, Department of Laws, Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar, is here in front of you to present a lecture on the topic, the Government of India Act 1858. Let's begin with an introduction. The constitutional development of India is directly linked with the advent of Britishers as their colonial powers. The history can be traced back from the coming of East India Company in 1600. It is noteworthy here that the Pitt's India Act of 1784 brought a system of double government which ultimately failed because the Board of Control was found to be inefficient. Accordingly, the then Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, rightly quoted, "The system of double government was complex, inconvenient and chaotic." It was seen that the country underwent many transitions and the revolt of 1857 just hastened the process. The administrative functions being followed in the country also included the ministerial responsibilities, thereby giving the responsibility to the Parliament, to the public and to the Crown. So, in order to have the better administration and the functioning of the country, the Government of India Act 1858 was initiated. The Government of India Act 1858 was an act of Parliament that basically transferred the government as well as the territories of East India Company to the British Crown. The Government of India Act 1858 also deprived the East India Company from its governing powers, ended up its Board of Control and gave all the possession in the hands of the Crown. Resultantly, the company's rule over the British territories came to an end and it went in the hands of British government. The United Kingdom Parliament then passed a law in that regard, which came to be known as Government of India Act 1858. The said act was then passed on 2nd August 1858. The United Kingdom Prime Minister and Lord Palmerston introduced the bill for transferring the power of the Indian government from the East India Company to the British Crown, thereby referring to the defects of the existing system of the Government of India. Nevertheless, before the bill was theorized to be passed, Lord Palmerston was then forced to resign due to some other issues. Subsequently, Edward Stanley, the person who was to be the first Secretary of State for India, then introduced a different bill which was seen as an act for the better government of India, and it was legislated on 2nd August 1858. Now let's talk about the background or the history of the Government of India Act 1858. As we know that the increasing bitterness in England against the rule of East India Company reached at its top where the mutiny of 1857 happened. However, the mutiny was tamped down, but the fright of mutiny in London actually persuaded the British Crown to take over the administration of India. Consequently, on 1st September 1858, the directors of the Court of East India Company, which were held by its last assembly, also issued its last instructions stating, "Gift of the vast country and turning billions and millions of Indians under her direct power. Let her appreciate it, but let her does not forget the very great corporation from which she had gotten them, nor the lessons to be learned from its success." This was very well quoted. Now let's talk about some of the very significant provisions of the Government of India Act 1858. The Act brought tremendous changes in the country through its legal framework. These legislative provisions compelled the removal of East India Company on many grounds and brought the entire control in the hands of Crown. Some of the most important provisions of the Government of India Act 1858 are discussed as follows. Number 1. The Indian territories were governed in the name of British Crown, and consequently the companies of East India were all abolished. Number 2. India was made a direct British colony. Number 3. The Act scrapped down the Court of Directors and the Board of Control. Number 4. The provision regarding the introduction of Indians into civil servants and the civil services also came up for an effective and smooth functioning of the country. Number 5. New office was created, that was of Secretary of State for India, which will have the complete authority and entire control over the Indian administration. This office of Secretary of State for India was to be a member of British and was wholly responsible to the British Parliament. Number 6. The Act further established a 15-member Council of India to aid and assist the Secretary of State for India. This council was to act as an advisory body, and the Secretary of State for India was given the charge of chairman of the council. Out of this 15-member council, 7 were to be elected by the Court of Directors and 8 were to be appointed by the Crown. The major part of the members were persons who had served or resided in India for at least 10 years and, with some exemptions, not left India more than 10 years before their appointment. In another provision, it was mentioned that no person other than a person so qualified to be appointed or elected to fill up any vacant seat in the council until and unless at the time of the appointment of election 9 at least of the continuing members of the council were the persons so qualified as aforesaid. Vacancies were to be filled by the courts as to crown appointments and by the council as to appointments by election. Next feature, one of the provisions of the Act also stated that the members of the council were to hold the office during good behavior and their removal will be subjected by the Crown upon an address of both houses of Parliament, and they were not capable to sit and vote in the Parliament. Another point, the Act provided some of the duties of the council. Now let's talk about some duties. Number 1, to conduct the business transacted in the United Kingdom in relation to the Government of India and correspondence with India under the direction of the Secretary of State. Second duty, the Secretary of State was to be the President of Council with the casting vote in cases of an equality of votes. Third duty, the council had to meet at least once in a week and the quorum of meeting was fixed to be 5. In case of any difference of opinion in the meeting of the council on any question other than the question of election of a member of council or with respect to which a majority vote was necessary, then in such cases the decision of the Secretary of State was to be the final. His written approval was mandatorily required for any such decision except the election of a member taken in his absence. Also another point, the Secretary of State might constitute few committees of the council for an effective and convenient transactions of the business. Also, it was to direct what department of business in relation to Government of India were under those committees and was also to direct them generally as to in which manner such businesses were to be transacted. Therefore, in this regard, many committees were formed like Finance Committee, Political Committee, Public Works Committee, Judicial and Public Committee, and many more. Another feature of the Act, that the Secretary of State for India was also to formulate and frame the policies for India. He had a casting vote and was also responsible to the Parliament and not to the Council. He could overrule their advice and had the power to receive secret dispatches from India. In this regard, when the telegraph line by submarine cable was laid through the Red Sea in 1870, his domination over the government of India became more strong. It is noteworthy that a year earlier in 1869, when the Suez Canal became operational, then the physical distance between India and England was considerably reduced. It can also be stated that when the territories of the company were taken over by the Crown, the Parliament lost its real hold and control over India. Initially, it was the Parliament who used to discuss policies to be sent to India via Board of Control and directors of the East India Company. But now, the situation was different. The true and real ruler was the Secretary of State for India, who had the unrestricted powers and full cabinet rank. Since then, the party politics started governing India. Another provision of the Act was that it mentioned in it very clearly that the Act constituted the Secretary of State and Council as a body corporate which will be capable of suing and to be sued both in India as well as in England. The Secretary of State and Council had full control over the expenditure of the revenues both in India and elsewhere. No grant or appropriation was to be made without the consent of the majority of the council. Another feature, the Secretary of State and Council was to lay before the Parliament yearly financial accounts for India, and along with that, special provision was made for the appointment of a special auditor of the accounts. Another point, all persons and other bodies might take the suits, remedies and proceedings against the Secretary of State and Council in the same manner as they might have done against the East India Company. Another important feature was the Secretary of State and Council, with the aid and advice of Civil Service Commissioner, had to make rules and regulations regarding the admission of all natural born British subjects to any competitive exams. Also, any such rules and regulations were to be laid before the House of Parliament. Another point, the Act also made an establishment of the positions of Governor General, who was to function as the representative of the British Government of India. The appointment of Governor General of India, the members of his council, governors and Advocate General were to be made by the Crown only. However, the appointment of remaining members of Governor General's Council and Governor's Council were to be made by the Secretary of State and Council with the consent of the majority of members. The appointments of the Lieutenant Governors were to be made by Governor General, subject to the approbation of the Crown. Another point, that was the Act also provided that all the other appointments made by any authority of India were continued to be made by the like authority, but at the same time, the Secretary of State and Council, with the concurrence of the majority of members, was given the full power to frame rules and regulations for the division and distribution of patronage, as well as power of nomination among the several authorities of India and another authority to restore their employment officers and servants that were suspended or removed by any of the authorities of India. Another very important feature was that the Act further mentioned that all the appointments relating to naval and military cadetship were in the hands of Crown. The names of such person to be recommended for cadetship and its service were to be submitted by the Secretary of State to the Crown. The matter regarding their appointments, admissions and other services, including altering or revoking, was within the control of Secretary of State and Council. Another very important feature was about the Office of Viceroy. The Office of Viceroy was to be assisted by the Executive Council while performing the administrative tasks of British India. Then, the system of dual government, which was introduced by Pitt's India Act 1784, was abolished, and it also removed the doctrine of lapse, which allowed the British to conquer states without a male hire. Further, the Act also permitted more than 560 Indian princes and chiefs to retain their independence as long as they recognized British suzerainty. The Act gave very limited control to legislative councils with regard to financial matters, including the power to discuss the budget and finances. But at the same time, the real and true financial control remained with the British government only. Another issue regarding the legal reforms. The Act also brought some legal reforms, including few changes in the judicial system, thereby establishing high courts and district courts. One proposal was also made in the Act that the pardon will be given to all the Indians who were the part of mutiny, but not to those who killed the Britishers working for the crown. So, I can say that these were some of the most significant provisions of the Government of India Act 1858. Now, let's talk something about the Government of India Act 1858 and the changes that were made in India. The Government of India Act of 1858 brought many changes in the working and administration of India. The Governor General was given the additional title of Viceroy, who was to act as a representative of the Crown with independent Indian princes. His executive council was to consist of 4 members, out of which 3 members were senior servants of the company. It was also made pertinent that the law member would attend the council when sits as a legislative body. Further, it was also observed that in 1859, Lord Canning was the Governor General and Viceroy, who then introduced the portfolio system. As a result of it, it started weakening the powers of the council and put a brake on the collective deliberations. At the same time, all the private communications within the Secretary of State for India started resulting in many policy discussions that were being made behind the council's back. Consequently, it was noticed that the ultimate result of the transfer of power was the complete weakening of the power of the Governor General. His government became a mere conduct for policies that used to come to him from the Secretary of State for India. It is quite pertinent to note here that the acts of the Government of India were just like a rubber stamp for the laws which the Secretary of State for India wanted to pass. Now, during this process, there was the Queen's Proclamation of 1858. The proclamation was made by the Queen in order to calm down the Indians who had revolted for many such acts of the Britishers. It was declared in the proclamation that a new government will be for the welfare of Indians without any discrimination on the grounds of religion or race. Some of the key points of declaration were: number 1, the government would not discriminate on any ground, and the only yardstick for giving jobs was the requisite qualifications. Also, the new government would not intervene with any type of Indian religious as well as traditions. Second point of proclamation: it was proclaimed that all the treaties made by the company would be honored now. Third point: it was declared that the government would not expand its territory, and therefore the Indian princes need not be scared of losing their territories anymore. Thereafter, the entire system was all set for the government policies, which were entirely based on the promises that were made by the Queen Victoria. Many sects of Indians were involved in the revolt for many reasons. But at the same time, English educated Indians were taken into consideration who actually valued the presence of Britishers in India. It was so because the support to the government was very essential. Simultaneously, the government took many steps so as to inform the general public about the policies and programs of the government. It is significant to mention that Queen Victoria's proclamation was fully successful in doing this. Resultantly, a new era dawned in such colonial rule. Such nature of administration formed a constitutional base. Along with this, seeds of nationalism were fully sown at that time. The evolution of legislature and the power of executive on one side and the realization of the nature of British rule on the other side became the threads in the Indian history from 1858 to 1947 as and when the country won independence. Now let's discuss some of the defects in the Government of India Act 1858. First defect, it continued with the British control. The major defect of the Government of India Act 1858 was that model for governance was very similar to that of the East India Company's rule. It displayed total imperialism and also restricted the representation of people. Accountability of Secretary of State for India. Another defect was realized that the newly designated post of Secretary of State for India was given complete and absolute control regarding the administration of India. In this regard, it was observed that such post of Secretary of State for India was only accountable to the British Parliament and had no responsibility or answerability towards the Indian citizens. Lack of Indian participation, a big defect. The Indians were not allowed to participate in highest levels of governmental task. It only allowed very limited participation, that too only in legislative councils, which itself had a very meagre powers. Cultural and regional diversities were totally ignored. The provisions of the Act imposed a uniform system of governance, which did not adequately honor various traditions, customs, and languages of the nation, thereby not taking into consideration the cultural, linguistic, and regional diversities. No sufficient provincial autonomy. There was a centralized system of governance which did not provide for enough autonomy to the provinces, which could have been addressed in a better way through local needs and requirements. Lack of comprehensive social reforms. The Act mainly focused on the maintenance of law and order, and the other social concerns like land reforms, caste discrimination, welfare of weaker and marginalized sections of society, etc., were completely ignored. Another defect was with regard to economic exploitation. The Act continued with allowing the Britishers to extract money from India through revenue, thereby causing economic exploitation to Indians. There was very limited education process. No doubt, some of the provisions of the Act provided for the allocation of funds for education, but there was no concrete and comprehensive plan for its growth. Education was provided only to elite class, and the Indian population was deprived even for primary education. Another big defect was regarding the neglect of Indian civil services. The Act did not make any provision for civil services to Indians, and it was dominated by British officials. Therefore, it created lack of understanding and other complexities in local cultural issues. Again, further, there was no concern for religious and communal tensions. The Act did not address any religious or communal tensions which arose in India during that time. Also, there was no provision for effective mechanism for resolving disputes and promoting harmony among varied religious groups. So now, let's talk about the conclusion after discussing all these defects. The Government of India Act 1858 also came to be known as the Act of Good Governance. It established a new and better system of governance in India, which came to be known as the British Raj, which continued for long and lasted till 15th August 1947, till the time the country became independent. But however, It didn't alter the system of government in the country for any betterment. Although the office of Secretary of State was, as per the provisions of the Act, supposed to be held by some of the powerful politicians, but the real power vested in the hands of Viceroy, who distributed his time mainly between Calcutta and Shimla. The provisions incorporated under the Act were merely to safeguard the jewel of British Empire against any sort of future threats or rebellions. Lastly, it should also be noted that in the late 1876, on the prompting of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, the Queen was given an additional title of Empress of India. Thank you everyone for your time and attention. We have discussed the entire concept in a short time, and I hope that the listeners have understood the topic. Stay safe, stay healthy. God bless you all. Take care.